Good afternoon. I am Dr. Kerp, an associate professor in history at Ohio University and also a fellow of our Contemporary History Institute. And I've been invited by Dr. Ingo Trauschweitzer, the director of our Contemporary History Institute, to share some of my thoughts and observations on the current Russo-Ukrainian crisis from a Polish perspective. I am a historian of contemporary Poland, and I think there is a good deal we can learn from Polish viewpoints on some of the challenges in responding to Russian initiatives, Russian aggression in Eastern Europe. And I say that with an awareness that, first and foremost, the history of Polish Russian relations is quite complicated and conflicted. Poland and Russia have, for the most part, over the last 500 years, been strategic competitors and hostile to one another. Interestingly enough, for our purposes, a good deal of that competition and hostility was generated in conflicts initiated by Polish and Russian efforts to control Ukraine. By the mid 20th century, in the aftermath of World War II, it had appeared that Poland had decisively lost any potential to influence Ukrainian politics, and that Ukraine was now entirely a Soviet and Russian area of influence and control. However, in the last part of the 20th century, the Soviet Union fell apart. Russia lost a great deal of influence in Ukraine, and many Polish statesmen, politicians, and other observers came to believe that maintaining Ukraine as an independent country was essential to Polish security, Polish freedom, and not just Polish freedom, but the freedom of the entire region. That both former Soviet spaces and other countries in Central Europe, as well as even Russia itself, required accepting and learning to live with an independent, free Ukraine. Another way in which Polish-Russian relations informs Polish perspectives on the current crisis is that Poles, even in the mid-1990s, observed a growing tendency for Russian imperial interest to reassert itself. And this is in spite of the fact that in 1989, there was a great deal of hope throughout Poland, from ordinary Poles all the way up to many social and political elites, that Polish-Russian relations could be put on a new footing in the aftermath of the collapse of communism. Not only were those hopes not realized in spite of what looked like a good beginning under the Yeltsin administration in Russia and President Wałęsa in Poland after 1989 to 91, but also, more importantly, growing Russian ambitions, the renewal of Russian efforts to influence and gain control of formerly Soviet spaces and exert influence into Central Europe, also informed Polish perspectives that there was a return of Russian imperial ambitions that included, among other things, direct Russian military threats against Poland in the early 21st century over Polish agreement to support the American installation of a missile shield in the region to defend Europe, actually from potential Iranian assaults, that the Russians even saw that as a threat, was one of the many canaries in the coal mine for Polish analysts to realize Russian ambitions and a Russian sense of alienation from the West was baked into contemporary Western relations, Polish relations with Russia. Another way in which Poland can inform what we're seeing playing out is that Poland's relations with Ukraine have changed a great deal over the past 20 to 30 years, that there has been a bridging of the gap between Poland, Ukraine, and the West during that time. In the decades prior to 1989, you had a long tradition of Polish-Ukrainian hostility. The Ukrainian nationalist movement, to a significant degree, was formed in opposition to Polish efforts to continue to dominate significant portions of Ukraine, culturally, intellectually, as well as socioeconomically. The conflict between Poles and Ukrainians culminated in World War II from the Polish perspective with the Wołyńska Rzeź, the Volhynian massacres, where Polish nationalists, in collaboration with Nazi Germany, even though they were pursuing Ukrainian goals, they were working with the Nazis to do it, proceeded to ethnically cleanse large portions of Ukraine of any Polish minorities. And this ethnic cleansing often included quite horrific campaigns of mass murder and destruction of Polish villages, and led to the flight of several 100,000 Polish refugees to what is today's Poland's borders, and where they brought stories of Ukrainian cruelty. Now, Poles themselves responded with force to these Ukrainian campaigns, committed their own war crimes. But the Polish government, after the war, a communist dominated government at the behest of Moscow, sought to emphasize Polish Ukrainian enmity. That in many ways endured until the last 20 to 30 years, where the beginnings of Ukrainian migration to Poland in search of work started to create improved people to people ties. And those ties grew closer in the aftermath of major Russian intervention, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, where hundreds of thousands of other Ukrainian refugees fled to Poland in search of safety, in search of a better life, often found it, even though the current Polish government has a well earned reputation of opposing Middle Eastern immigration and has often entered into disputes with the European Union over that. In relation to Ukrainians, Poland has been incredibly generous. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are working in Poland with official papers, with support of the Polish government. The Ukrainian diaspora in Poland, as in other Western countries, have worked rather hard to assert Ukrainian interests in the current crisis. So we're seeing both, if you will, a renewal of Russo-Polish tensions, but also a lessening of Polish-Ukrainian tensions at this time. And finally, it's important to remember and to mention Polish tensions with its Western allies. Even though Poland is a member of both NATO and the EU, that collaboration is at times also quite conflicted. Germany, in particular, with which Poland also has a rather checkered history, has attempted to ratchet down tensions with Russia, often in ways that many Poles regard as a policy of appeasement and ignoring Putin and his cronies' aggression throughout the region, even against fellow European Union members and NATO members like those in the Baltic states, Poland and Romania, as well as countries outside of the EU NATO's direct sphere of influence. And Poles have pointed out that German economic interests have often played a major role in this effort at German outreach to Russia. And so there's been a Polish concern that the Germans give lip service to European values of democratization, autonomy, and the rights of smaller countries, but in practice are still searching for an accommodation with Russia. And similar concerns also are at play in Polish perceptions of American efforts at times to reach out to Russia. If you remember the famous, or from the Polish perspective, relatively infamous Obama effort at reset of American-Russian relations in the aftermath of his election, that entailed, among other things, ignoring Russia's invasion of Georgia. Also, the Obama administration had initially embraced the idea of a missile shield in Eastern Europe and then denounced it and said we were no longer going to pursue a missile shield that would include basing in Poland. And the day of our announcement was the 17th of December, 2009, a particularly bad day, precisely because it was the 70th anniversary of the Nazi-Soviet military collaboration against Poland at the outbreak of World War II, where Soviet armies rolled into Poland on the 17th of September. So what I want to suggest is there are crises of Western values that not only include ways in which we're conflicted about what to do about Russia, but in ways in which Western countries have been contradicting self proclaimed values and, in addition, have not been working well with many of our friends and allies to whom we have made commitments and who, in theory, whose input we are open to. But in practice, different major powers in the Western alliance, from the United States to Germany and France, etc., pursue their own interests in ways that, again, contradict professed Western values and have encouraged Russian regional predation. All of these things have made this crisis particularly difficult to deal with and have wrong footed Western efforts at unity. And Poland finds itself at the center of some of those problems.